Before the judge signs those papers, Your Honor, you should probably hear her full name. The voice didn't belong to Claire Whitmore, but the words hung in the air like a crack in perfectly polished glass. A few minutes earlier, the courtroom had felt routine, almost bored, the kind of gray Tuesday morning in Manhattan when divorce cases stacked up like paperwork no one wanted to read. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The smell of old wood and printer toner clung to the air. And at the center of it all sat Claire Whitmore, quiet and almost invisible in a simple navy coat that looked more practical than fashionable. 10 years of marriage were being reduced to a few typed pages and a signature. Across the room, Andrew Whitmore looked relaxed, almost amused, leaning back slightly beside his expensive attorney in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Claire's entire wardrobe. Andrew had the kind of confidence that came from growing up surrounded by money and people who agreed with him. His family's whispers had already filled the courtroom before the hearing even began. She contributed nothing. She lived off his name. She was lucky to marry into the Whitmore family at all. The words floated through the quiet rows of observers like dust drifting in sunlight. Claire didn't respond to any of it. She sat with her hands folded gently in her lap, fingers still, shoulders calm, as if she were listening to rain on a window instead of the dismantling of her life. The judge, a man who had seen thousands of divorces and far too many bitter endings, glanced down at the paperwork in front of him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said in a measured tone, "your husband's counsel has proposed a settlement in which you waive any financial claims in exchange for a clean dissolution of the marriage. Do you understand these terms?" Claire lifted her eyes slowly. They were steady, clear, not angry, not desperate, just calm in a way that made a few people in the gallery shift in their seats. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. Andrew's attorney gave a satisfied nod, tapping the stack of documents with a manicured finger. "My client believes this arrangement is fair given the circumstances," he said smoothly. Andrew's faint smile returned, the expression of a man watching a problem finally disappear. For a moment the entire room seemed ready to move on. Pens hovered. Papers waited. A marriage that once filled magazine pages and charity galas was about to vanish in less than 10 minutes. Then the judge adjusted his glasses and spoke again. "For the record, Mrs. Whitmore, please confirm your full legal name." It was a routine request, one no one in the courtroom paid much attention to. Claire straightened slightly in her chair. The movement was small, but it carried a quiet certainty that somehow drew every eye toward her. She took a slow breath and spoke clearly, each word precise. "My legal name is Claire Eleanor Whitmore." For half a second nothing happened. Then the courtroom clerk froze, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as she stared at the screen in front of her. The quiet room shifted, the kind of subtle ripple that moves through a crowd when something unexpected has just begun. The courtroom clerk blinked once, then again, as if her eyes were trying to correct something impossible on the screen. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but did not move. The quiet murmur in the gallery faded into a strange stillness that crept slowly through the room. Judge Harper noticed first. He leaned forward slightly, the leather of his chair creaking softly as he studied the clerk. "Is there an issue?" he asked calmly. The clerk swallowed and glanced at the monitor again before answering. "Your Honor, I just need a moment to confirm something in the system." It was a simple sentence, but something in her tone caused several attorneys in the room to lift their heads. Andrew Whitmore frowned faintly. This was supposed to be routine. A quick confirmation, a signature, and the end of a marriage that had already been erased from his future plans months ago. He leaned toward his lawyer. "What is she doing?" he whispered under his breath. The attorney gave a small, dismissive shrug, clearly expecting the delay to last only a few seconds. But the clerk did not continue typing. Instead, she turned her chair slightly toward the judge and lowered her voice. "Your Honor," the name she just stated, it triggered a restricted financial registry. A few people in the courtroom exchanged puzzled looks. Judge Harper raised an eyebrow. "A registry related to what?" he asked. The clerk hesitated before answering. "Corporate ownership records, Your Honor. Extremely large ones." The room did not explode with noise, but a ripple of quiet curiosity began to spread across the wooden benches like wind brushing over water. Andrew straightened in his seat. His confidence wavered for the first time. "That does not make sense," he said quietly to his attorney. "Claire does not own anything." At the center table, Claire Whitmore remained still, her hands resting lightly together as though the conversation unfolding around her had nothing to do with her at all. Judge Harper looked back toward her. His voice was calm, but slightly more attentive now. "Mrs. Whitmore, have you ever used another legal surname?" Claire lifted her gaze again. The calm expression on her face had not changed. "No, Your Honor," she replied. "I have always used my full legal name when necessary." The clerk slowly turned the monitor so the judge could see it. A faint reflection of blue light touched his glasses as he read. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in careful recognition. Around the room, several attorneys leaned forward, trying to glimpse the screen from where they sat. One of them, an older lawyer seated near the back, suddenly inhaled sharply. "Whitmore Holdings," he murmured under his breath. The words were not loud, but they traveled across the silent courtroom with surprising clarity. Andrew heard them. His head turned immediately. "Whitmore Holdings?" he repeated, confusion edging into his voice. His lawyer stiffened slightly beside him, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his polished expression. Across the room, Claire Whitmore remained perfectly composed, as if the name meant nothing unusual. But inside the quiet courtroom something had shifted. A name that moments ago sounded ordinary had begun to echo with a very different meaning. And more than one person in the room was starting to realize that the woman they had dismissed as powerless might not be who they believed she was. The silence that followed the whisper of Whitmore Holdings felt heavier than the thick oak doors of the courtroom. Andrew Whitmore felt the shift before he fully understood it. A few minutes earlier, every eye in the room had looked at Claire with quiet dismissal, the forgotten wife sitting alone at the end of a long marriage. Now those same eyes had begun to study her again, not with pity, but with something closer to curiosity. Judge Harper slowly leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving from the glowing monitor to the woman seated calmly before him. Years on the bench had taught him to recognize the moment when an ordinary case stopped being ordinary. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "the court record indicates that your name is associated with several corporate filings. Are you aware of this?" Claire did not rush to answer. She seemed to consider the question with the same calm patience she had shown since the hearing began. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Yes, Your Honor, I am aware." The courtroom clerk adjusted the monitor again, and the judge read another line silently. His expression did not change much, but the quiet tightening of his jaw told the room that the information in front of him was far from trivial. In the gallery, the older attorney who had spoken earlier leaned toward the colleague beside him. "That holding group manages infrastructure funds across half the country," he murmured quietly. "Transportation networks, ports, energy projects. Tens of billions under management." Andrew heard enough of the whisper to feel a cold knot form in his stomach. He turned sharply toward his lawyer. "What are they talking about?" he asked. The attorney no longer looked relaxed. His eyes were fixed on the screen near the judge. For the first time since the hearing began, he did not have an immediate answer. At the center table, Claire Whitmore still sat with the same quiet composure, but the atmosphere around her had changed completely. The room no longer saw a woman being dismissed from a marriage. They were beginning to see someone they did not understand. Judge Harper finally cleared his throat and addressed the clerk again. "Confirm the registry entry." The clerk nodded quickly, her fingers moving across the keyboard. The soft clicking sound echoed through the silent courtroom like distant rain. A moment later she spoke. "Your Honor, the financial registry lists Claire Eleanor Whitmore as the principal beneficiary and controlling shareholder of Whitmore Holdings Group." The words settled slowly into the room. A faint gasp came from somewhere in the back row. Andrew Whitmore stared at Claire as if the woman sitting across the courtroom had suddenly become a stranger. "That is impossible," he said quietly. But the judge had already lifted his gaze again toward Claire, his voice measured and respectful in a way it had not been before. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "before this court proceeds any further, it appears we need to clarify exactly who you are." And for the first time since the hearing began, Claire Whitmore allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch the corner of her lips. For a long moment no one in the courtroom spoke. The faint hum of the overhead lights suddenly sounded louder than before, filling the space that had once been occupied by quiet confidence and routine procedure. Judge Harper studied Claire Whitmore with renewed attention, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. A few minutes ago she had been nothing more than another name on a divorce docket. Now the air around her carried a different weight. Andrew Whitmore felt it too. His hands tightened slightly against the edge of the polished wooden table in front of him. "Your Honor," his attorney began carefully, attempting to recover the smooth authority he had displayed earlier. "With respect, the corporate registry must be referencing a different individual. My client's wife has never been involved in any such business entity." The words sounded confident, but the lawyer's eyes flicked once more toward the glowing monitor before the judge, and that single glance betrayed a growing uncertainty. Judge Harper did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned again toward the clerk. "Run the confirmation through the federal corporate database," he said calmly. The clerk nodded quickly and began typing again. The quiet clicking of keys echoed across the courtroom benches where observers leaned forward with growing curiosity. Andrew glanced across the room at Claire. For the first time in years, he studied her face with real attention. During their marriage, he had grown accustomed to seeing her in the background of his life, standing beside him at charity events, greeting his business partners politely, listening more than speaking. She had always seemed comfortable letting him lead every conversation, every decision, every introduction. But now something about that memory felt incomplete. Claire sat perfectly composed, her back straight, her hands still folded together as if the courtroom tension had nothing to do with her. She did not rush to defend herself. She did not interrupt the judge. She simply waited. Andrew suddenly realized something unsettling. In 10 years of marriage, he had never once asked about her family history in detail. He had accepted the simple answers she gave and moved on, confident that whatever her past might be, it could not possibly rival the influence of the Whitmore name he carried. Across the gallery, the older attorney who had whispered earlier leaned forward again, watching the screen with quiet intensity. "If that registry is correct," he murmured softly to the colleague beside him, "then the holding group behind those infrastructure funds is not just large. It is one of the most powerful investment networks in North America." The colleague frowned. "You mean the one tied to international shipping and energy corridors?" The older man nodded once. "Exactly." At that moment, the clerk stopped typing. She stared at the screen for a second, then turned slowly toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "the federal database confirms the same record. Claire Eleanor Whitmore is listed as the controlling shareholder of Whitmore Holdings Group." The words settled over the room like a sudden change in gravity. Andrew felt the breath leave his chest. His lawyer said nothing this time. Judge Harper removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk before him, studying Claire with calm deliberation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said at last, his tone now carrying unmistakable respect, "it appears this court has misunderstood your position in this case. Before we continue these proceedings, I believe you may have information that deserves to be heard." Claire lifted her eyes to meet the judge's gaze. For the first time since entering the courtroom, the quiet patience in her expression carried a hint of something else, not arrogance, not triumph, but the calm confidence of someone who had been waiting a very long time for the room to finally ask the right question. Claire Whitmore did not answer immediately. The courtroom waited, the silence stretching long enough that every small sound became noticeable. Someone in the back shifted in their seat. A pen rolled quietly across a wooden desk. Even the faint rumble of traffic somewhere outside the courthouse windows seemed louder than before. Claire slowly uncrossed her hands and placed them lightly on the table in front of her. The movement was small, but it carried a quiet certainty that drew every eye in the room toward her again. Judge Harper watched her carefully. A few minutes earlier, he had been preparing to finalize another routine divorce settlement. Now he understood that something far more complicated had walked into his courtroom that morning. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, "the court would like clarification regarding the corporate record connected to your name." Claire lifted her gaze and met his eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle and steady. "Of course, Your Honor." Andrew Whitmore felt the tension tightening in his chest. The calmness in her voice unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He leaned toward his attorney again, speaking under his breath. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "She never told me anything about a company." His lawyer did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Claire with the careful attention of someone who suddenly realized the case in front of him was no longer simple. Claire continued speaking, her tone measured and clear. "Whitmore Holdings Group was established by my grandfather nearly 50 years ago," she said. The words settled over the courtroom benches like a quiet ripple. Andrew blinked in confusion. His mind searched through years of conversations, dinners, holidays, and casual mentions of family history. He could not remember her ever describing a grandfather involved in a global investment network. Claire went on, her voice calm, as if she were explaining something ordinary rather than something that had just shifted the entire atmosphere of the hearing. The company began as a small shipping investment firm on the East Coast, she said. Over the decades, it expanded into transportation infrastructure, port development, and energy logistics. Today, it manages operations across several states and international trade routes. The older attorney seated in the gallery nodded slowly, as though confirming details he already suspected. Andrew stared at Claire, struggling to connect the woman he had known with the quiet authority now filling the courtroom. Judge Harper listened without interrupting, his hands folded thoughtfully in front of him. "And your role within this company?" he asked. Claire answered without hesitation. "I inherited controlling shares after my grandfather retired," she said. "The transfer was finalized 5 years ago." 5 years. The number echoed silently through Andrew's thoughts. 5 years earlier, he and Claire had been celebrating their wedding anniversary at a charity dinner in Manhattan. Photographs from that evening still existed somewhere in the archives of social pages and event magazines. He remembered the night clearly. The bright lights, the speeches, the donors and board members shaking his hand while Claire stood beside him smiling. Quietly. 5 years earlier, she had already been the controlling shareholder of one of the most powerful investment groups in the country, and he had never known. Across the courtroom, the clerk glanced again at the monitor, almost as if the information still surprised her. Judge Harper leaned back slightly, considering everything he had heard. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet weight that had not been there before. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "it appears that the financial position presented to this court earlier may not reflect the full circumstances of this marriage." Claire Whitmore held his gaze calmly. In the stillness that followed, the entire room began to understand something Andrew Whitmore had not yet fully accepted. The woman they had expected to leave with nothing might have been the most powerful person in the courtroom all along. The weight of the judge's words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. For several seconds, no one in the courtroom moved. The earlier confidence that had filled Andrew Whitmore's side of the room had quietly dissolved, replaced by something far less comfortable. Andrew stared at Claire as if the woman seated across from him had suddenly become someone entirely unfamiliar. 10 years of marriage replayed through his mind in scattered fragments. Quiet dinners, charity galas, boardroom celebrations where his colleagues congratulated him, while Claire stood beside him with the same composed smile she wore now. He had always believed she lived in the shadow of his success. Now he was beginning to wonder if the truth had been the opposite all along. Judge Harper folded his hands together on the bench, studying the documents displayed on the monitor beside him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "when this court began today's proceedings, the financial disclosure suggested that you possessed minimal personal assets. Yet according to federal records, you are the controlling shareholder of an international holding group. Can you explain why this information was not presented earlier?" Claire listened carefully before answering. Her voice carried the same calm clarity it had shown throughout the hearing. "Your Honor, the assets connected to Whitmore Holdings were never part of my personal financial filings within this marriage." A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. Andrew's attorney leaned forward immediately. "Your Honor, that statement requires clarification," he said. "If Mrs. Whitmore controlled such significant financial resources, the court should have been informed." Claire turned her head slightly toward the attorney, her expression polite but steady. "Those resources were placed under a legal trust structure before my marriage began," she said. "The trust prohibits their inclusion in marital financial disclosures unless I personally authorize their release." The explanation landed in the courtroom like a slow realization spreading across the room. The older attorney in the gallery gave a small nod as if the legal framework now made perfect sense. Andrew felt the ground shifting beneath everything he believed about the case. He leaned toward his lawyer again, his voice strained. "You told me she had nothing," he whispered. The lawyer did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the judge with a careful expression that suggested he was reconsidering every document he had reviewed earlier. Judge Harper turned slightly toward the clerk. Retrieve the trust registry associated with Whitmore Holdings, he instructed calmly. The clerk began typing again, the quiet tapping of keys echoing across the silent room. Claire remained composed while the system processed the request. She had spent years inside rooms much larger than this one, negotiating investment agreements and infrastructure contracts that shaped trade routes across continents. Compared to those negotiations, the tension of a courtroom felt almost familiar. But across the table, Andrew Whitmore sat very still, the certainty he had carried into the building that morning slowly unraveling. He remembered the conversation only 3 weeks earlier when he told Claire the marriage was over. He remembered the calm way she had accepted the decision without arguing, without pleading, without trying to defend herself. At the time he had taken that silence as defeat. Now the memory felt very different. A soft chime sounded from the clerk's computer. She looked at the screen and then toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said quietly. "The registry confirms the trust structure. Claire Eleanor Whitmore is listed as the primary beneficiary and executive authority of the Whitmore Global Trust." The room fell silent once more, but this time the silence carried a different understanding. What had begun as a routine divorce hearing had transformed into something no one present had expected, and Andrew Whitmore was only beginning to understand how little he had ever known about the woman sitting across from him. Andrew Whitmore felt the air in the courtroom grow strangely thin as the clerk finished reading the registry confirmation. The quiet tapping of her keyboard faded, leaving only the distant hum of fluorescent lights above them. A few minutes earlier the room had belonged to him. The confident husband, the successful businessman, the man whose lawyer had walked in expecting to close the case before lunch. Now every set of eyes in the courtroom seemed to be drifting toward Claire Whitmore instead. Andrew's mind struggled to process the explanation that had just been placed on the record. A global trust, a corporate structure older than his own company, a financial network tied to ports, shipping routes, and energy corridors that stretched across multiple states. He tried to remember if Claire had ever mentioned anything about it during their marriage. Any hint, any conversation. But the harder he searched his memory, the more he realized how little he had actually asked about her life before they met. Claire had always been quiet about her background. He had interpreted that silence as simplicity. Now it felt like something very different. Judge Harper leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the documents displayed beside him. Years of presiding over complicated financial cases had taught him to recognize the structure of powerful investment groups, and the name appearing in the registry was not unfamiliar. Whitmore Holdings Group had appeared in major infrastructure agreements across the country. Ports in California, rail expansions in Texas, energy terminals along the Atlantic coast. Projects measured not in millions, but in billions of dollars. And the woman seated calmly in front of him was listed as the controlling authority behind that network. The judge looked up again, his voice steady but thoughtful. "Mrs. Whitmore, the existence of a protected trust explains why these assets were not included in marital filings," he said. "However, it also raises important questions about the circumstances surrounding this case." Claire nodded slightly. "I understand, Your Honor." Her tone remained respectful, but there was a quiet confidence beneath the words that had not been present earlier in the hearing. Across the room, Andrew's attorney adjusted the collar of his suit, clearly recalculating the legal landscape that had shifted beneath him. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "the original settlement proposal was based on the assumption that Mrs. Whitmore possessed no independent financial leverage. If the situation is more complex than previously believed, we may need to reconsider the structure of the agreement." The sentence was carefully worded, but everyone in the courtroom understood what it meant. The terms Andrew Whitmore had expected to finalize that morning were no longer secure. Andrew felt a slow pressure building behind his temples. Only weeks earlier he had walked into his home and calmly informed Claire that their marriage was over. He had already prepared the legal strategy. A clean break. A settlement that left her with nothing significant. He had expected resistance, maybe even anger. Instead, she had listened quietly, almost thoughtfully, before agreeing to proceed with the divorce. At the time he believed her silence meant she had no choice. Now that memory carried a completely different meaning. Claire Whitmore had not argued because she had never needed to. Judge Harper rested his hands on the bench again, his gaze moving from Andrew to Claire and back once more. The room waited for his next words. Outside the courthouse windows, the afternoon traffic of Manhattan moved steadily through the streets, unaware that inside this courtroom the balance of power had quietly shifted. And Andrew Whitmore was only beginning to understand that the woman he believed he was discarding from his life might have been the most powerful partner he had ever had. The courtroom remained suspended in a fragile silence after the judge's last words, as if everyone present understood that the next few minutes could reshape the entire case. Andrew Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, the polished wood creaking beneath the movement. Only an hour earlier he had entered the courthouse convinced that this hearing would be quick and predictable. His lawyer had assured him the documents were solid. The settlement was clear. Claire would leave with nothing significant, and he would walk away free to continue his life without complication. That certainty now felt distant, almost naive. Across the room, Claire Whitmore remained composed, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that made several people in the gallery watch her more closely. Judge Harper studied both sides of the courtroom before speaking again. Given the new information presented today, he said slowly, the court cannot proceed with the original settlement without further clarification. Andrew's attorney nodded cautiously. Your Honor, we agree that additional financial review may be necessary. The statement was carefully controlled, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. Only 30 minutes earlier he had spoken with the relaxed confidence of someone expecting an easy conclusion. Now every word carried the caution of a man reassessing the ground beneath his argument. Claire listened quietly, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. Judge Harper turned toward her again. Mrs. Whitmore, one matter remains unclear to the court, he said. If you have controlled this trust for the past 5 years, why was your involvement never mentioned during the financial disclosures associated with this marriage? The question settled gently into the room. Claire paused before answering, her eyes briefly lowering as if considering the weight of years behind the moment. Because, Your Honor, she said softly, the trust agreement required complete confidentiality. Andrew frowned immediately. Confidentiality from whom? He asked before his lawyer could stop him. Claire turned her gaze toward him for the first time since the hearing began. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet honesty that somehow felt heavier than accusation. From everyone, she replied calmly. Including you. The words hung between them. Andrew felt a sudden pressure in his chest as old memories surfaced unexpectedly. The quiet weekends when Claire disappeared for several hours, explaining that she needed time to handle family obligations. The long phone calls she sometimes took in another room, always brief, always polite. At the time he had barely noticed. His own career had filled most of his attention. He had assumed her responsibilities were minor, perhaps related to distant relatives or small investments. Now those forgotten moments returned with new meaning. Judge Harper observed the exchange carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, he continued, does the trust documentation place any restrictions on your personal financial decisions within this marriage? Claire nodded slightly. Yes, Your Honor. The trust prohibits direct financial integration with any spouse unless a formal disclosure agreement is signed. Andrew's lawyer leaned forward quickly. And such an agreement was never executed? Claire shook her head once. No, it was not. The implication rippled across the room with quiet clarity. The fortune connected to Whitmore Holdings had never been legally tied to the marriage at all. Andrew Whitmore felt the realization settle slowly through his thoughts. The woman he believed depended on his wealth had actually lived beside him for a decade, while quietly controlling resources far beyond anything he possessed. And as the courtroom absorbed the truth, the balance of the entire case continued to shift in ways no one had anticipated when the hearing first began. Andrew Whitmore sat motionless after Claire's last words, the meaning of them settling slowly through the room like a quiet storm that no one had expected. The trust had never been connected to the marriage. The wealth had never belonged to their shared life. It had existed beside it, protected by legal walls he had never even known were there. Around the courtroom, the observers whispered softly, careful not to break the tense atmosphere that had replaced the routine calm of the morning hearing. Judge Harper remained silent for several seconds, reviewing the information displayed on the monitor in front of him. The structure of the trust was now clearly documented. The controlling authority, the transfer date, the corporate oversight connected to Whitmore Holdings Group. It was all legitimate. It was all legally separate from the marriage that had just unraveled in front of the court. Andrew's attorney adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the documents on his own tablet, reading each line with increasing caution. The strategy he had prepared was no longer reliable. Every assumption that supported the original settlement had been built on incomplete information. And now the foundation beneath that strategy was dissolving. Judge Harper finally looked up again. His voice remained calm, but the direction of the hearing had clearly changed. "Mr. Whitmore," he said evenly, "the financial disclosures presented by your counsel suggested that your wife held no independent economic authority within this marriage. Based on the records now before this court, that assumption appears inaccurate." Andrew felt every eye turn toward him. For the first time that morning, he did not immediately know what to say. The courtroom that had once felt comfortably familiar now seemed strangely unfamiliar, as though the ground beneath his life had shifted without warning. "Your Honor," his attorney said carefully, attempting to regain control of the moment. "The original disclosure documents were completed in good faith based on the information available to my client." Judge Harper nodded slightly. "That may be true," he said. "However, the court must evaluate the circumstances as they actually exist." Claire Whitmore remained quiet during the exchange, her calm presence drawing subtle attention from everyone in the room. She had not raised her voice once. She had not interrupted anyone. Yet the entire direction of the hearing now seemed to revolve around information connected to her name. Andrew looked at her again, searching her expression for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But the woman sitting across the room looked exactly as she always had during difficult conversations. Calm, thoughtful, patient. The same woman who had listened quietly 3 weeks earlier when he told her the marriage was finished. At the time he had expected tears or anger. Instead she had simply nodded and asked when he planned to file the paperwork. Now he wondered if she had already known how this moment would unfold. Judge Harper rested his hands on the bench once more. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said thoughtfully, "one final matter requires clarification. The court understands that your trust assets remain legally separate from this marriage. However, the presence of such authority raises an important question." The room seemed to lean forward as he spoke. Claire lifted her eyes toward the judge again, her posture steady. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge studied her for a moment before continuing. "If your financial independence was never in question, then the court must ask why you agreed to proceed with a settlement that left you with nothing." The question settled across the courtroom like the final piece of a puzzle no one had yet solved. For the first time since the hearing began, several observers leaned forward in genuine curiosity. And Andrew Whitmore felt a slow realization forming in his mind as he turned toward the woman he thought he understood. Because if Claire Whitmore had never needed his money, then the quiet acceptance she showed 3 weeks earlier might not have been weakness at all. The judge's question lingered in the air long enough that even the faint rustle of paper seemed unusually loud. Why would a woman who controlled billions agree to walk away with nothing? The courtroom waited for Claire Whitmore to answer, and for the first time that morning the silence felt heavier than any legal argument that had been spoken. Claire did not rush. She lifted her hands from the table slowly and folded them again in front of her, as if the weight of the moment deserved careful attention. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, the same quiet tone that had carried through the entire hearing. "Because the settlement was never about money, Your Honor." A faint ripple moved across the gallery. Andrew Whitmore felt his chest tighten slightly. The answer was not what he expected. Judge Harper studied her with thoughtful curiosity. "Then what was it about?" he asked. Claire turned her head slightly toward Andrew, not with bitterness, but with a quiet honesty that seemed almost gentle. "Closure," she said simply. Andrew felt the words settle into him like something heavier than accusation. For a moment neither of them spoke. The courtroom seemed to disappear into the background as years of memory quietly resurfaced between them. Claire continued speaking, her voice steady but reflective. "When Andrew told me he wanted to end the marriage, I did not argue because I understood something important. A relationship cannot survive once one person has already decided it is finished." Several observers in the room shifted slightly, drawn into the quiet sincerity of her explanation. Claire kept her eyes on the judge as she spoke. "The financial settlement he proposed did not matter to me. The trust had always been separate. The resources connected to my family were never part of our marriage, and I never intended to make them part of the divorce. Andrew's lawyer listened carefully, his expression now completely different from the confident smile he wore earlier that morning. Judge Harper nodded slightly. Yet you allowed the court to believe you were leaving with nothing. Claire answered without hesitation. Because in a way I was. The judge raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting for her to continue. Claire's voice softened, but it did not lose its calm clarity. A marriage is not measured by assets or contracts. When it ends, both people lose something that cannot be recorded on a financial disclosure. The quiet statement settled gently through the courtroom. Andrew lowered his gaze toward the table, the polished wood reflecting a faint blur of light from the overhead fixtures. For the first time since the hearing began, he felt something that had nothing to do with legal strategy or financial risk. It was the realization that the woman he had spent 10 years beside had understood the end of their marriage with far more clarity than he had. Judge Harper leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing the meaning of her explanation. Mrs. Whitmore, he said after a moment, your position in this matter is certainly unusual. Claire allowed a small, polite smile to appear for the briefest moment. I understand that, Your Honor. The judge glanced once more at the financial records on the screen beside him, then back toward both parties seated before the bench. The courtroom waited again, aware that the next words spoken in the room could determine how the case would move forward. And as Andrew Whitmore sat quietly across from Claire, he began to realize that the divorce he believed would erase her from his life might end up revealing just how much of that life he had never truly understood. The courtroom remained quiet after Claire finished speaking, but the silence now carried a different kind of gravity. It was no longer the stillness of confusion. It was the stillness that follows when everyone in the room realizes the story they believed was incomplete. Judge Harper rested his hands together on the bench and studied both sides of the courtroom carefully. Years of presiding over complicated cases had taught him that the truth of a situation often appeared only after the most confident arguments had already been spoken. Mrs. Whitmore, he said calmly, your explanation clarifies your intentions regarding the settlement. However, the court must also consider whether the agreement presented earlier was formed under accurate assumptions. Andrew Whitmore shifted slightly in his seat, his earlier confidence now completely gone. He looked toward his attorney, waiting for guidance, but the lawyer seemed equally thoughtful, reviewing the documents again as though they belonged to a different case entirely. The judge continued speaking. Mr. Whitmore's counsel proposed a settlement that would have transferred no marital assets to you. That proposal was based on the belief that you possessed no independent financial authority. We now know that assumption was incorrect. Andrew cleared his throat softly. Your Honor, he said, attempting to regain some composure. Claire never told me about any of this. Claire did not react immediately. She simply listened, the same quiet patience in her expression that had remained throughout the hearing. Judge Harper nodded slightly. That may be true, he said. But the legal standing of a marriage does not depend on what one spouse chooses to disclose informally. Andrew lowered his gaze again, realizing that the argument he had just made offered him very little protection inside a courtroom. Claire finally spoke again, her voice steady and thoughtful. Your Honor, I did not intend to mislead the court. The trust agreement required confidentiality, and I honored that obligation. Judge Harper studied her carefully. And yet you are willing to acknowledge it now. Claire nodded once. Because the question was asked directly. The simplicity of the statement drew a faint reaction from several attorneys in the gallery. It was the answer of someone who understood exactly where the boundaries of legal responsibility were drawn. The judge turned his attention back to the documents on the screen. Based on the information presented today, he said slowly, the court must determine whether the original settlement terms remain fair to both parties. Andrew's attorney straightened slightly. Your Honor, if the financial independence of Mrs. Whitmore is established, then the original settlement could still be considered equitable. Judge Harper did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked once more at Claire Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore, he said thoughtfully, given the circumstances now before the court, you are no longer obligated to accept the agreement previously proposed. The words settled quietly across the room. For the first time since the hearing began, Claire paused longer before answering. Andrew watched her closely, a strange mixture of uncertainty and regret beginning to form in his thoughts. Only weeks earlier, he had been certain the end of the marriage would remove Claire from his life entirely. Now he realized the decision in front of her carried far greater weight than anything he had expected. Claire lifted her eyes to meet the judge's gaze. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet strength in it that had grown steadily throughout the hearing. "Your Honor," she said gently, "I agreed to the settlement because I believed it was the simplest way to end something that had already ended." The courtroom listened carefully as she continued. But simplicity is not always the same as fairness. And as those words settled into the room, everyone present understood that the direction of the case had just shifted once again. Claire's final sentence lingered in the courtroom like the quiet toll of a distant bell. Simplicity is not always the same as fairness. The words settled into the room with a calm weight that no one seemed eager to interrupt. Judge Harper leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the woman seated before him with careful consideration. Over the course of the hearing, he had watched the narrative shift piece by piece, from a routine divorce settlement to something far more complex. Across the table, Andrew Whitmore felt the tension tightening behind his ribs. Only that morning he had walked into the courthouse confident that the process would end his marriage quickly and cleanly. Now he found himself facing a reality he had never imagined. The woman he believed he understood had revealed a life that existed entirely beyond his knowledge. Judge Harper folded his hands together and spoke with measured clarity. "Mrs. Whitmore, the court appreciates your honesty. The question now is whether you wish to reconsider the settlement agreement originally proposed." The room seemed to lean forward slightly, waiting for her answer. Andrew watched her closely, realizing that the next decision belonged entirely to her. Claire Whitmore did not rush the moment. She took a quiet breath, the steady composure she had carried throughout the hearing still present in her posture. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but unmistakably firm. "Yes, Your Honor. I would like the agreement to be reviewed." A soft ripple of reaction moved through the gallery. Andrew's attorney straightened immediately, adjusting his papers as if preparing for a completely different negotiation than the one he had expected earlier that morning. Judge Harper nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "The court will suspend the current settlement for further evaluation." Andrew felt the words strike him with unexpected force. The outcome he had planned so carefully was slipping further away with each passing minute. Claire continued speaking before anyone else could respond. "Your Honor, I want to be clear about something." The judge gestured for her to continue. "This is not about punishment," she said gently. "I did not come here to prove a point or embarrass anyone." The quiet sincerity of the statement drew the attention of everyone in the room. Andrew looked at her again, searching for anger or resentment in her expression. Instead, he found something far more unsettling. Understanding. Claire lowered her gaze briefly before continuing. "But fairness matters," she said softly. "A marriage is a partnership, even when it ends." Judge Harper listened carefully. "And what outcome would you consider fair?" Claire lifted her eyes again, her voice steady. "I believe the court should review the full history of our shared assets and contributions during the marriage before deciding anything further." The statement was simple, but its implication was unmistakable. The divorce that Andrew had expected to finish within an hour had just become a far more serious legal process. Judge Harper nodded thoughtfully. "That is a reasonable request," he said. He turned toward both attorneys. "Counselors, this case will require a revised financial examination before the court proceeds with any final decision." Andrew sat very still as the meaning of the ruling settled over him. The story he had told himself about the end of his marriage had already begun to change. And as Claire Whitmore sat quietly across the courtroom, calm and composed, it became clear to everyone present that the final chapter of this case had not yet been written. The quiet movement of papers signaled that the hearing was nearing its end, but the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed in a way no one present would soon forget. What began as a routine legal procedure had transformed into something far more revealing, not just about finances or contracts, but about the truth hidden inside a decade of marriage. Judge Harper closed the folder in front of him with deliberate care. "This court will schedule a full financial review," he said calmly. "Until that time, the previously proposed settlement is suspended." The sound of his gavel was gentle but final, echoing softly through the high ceiling of the courtroom. The hearing was officially paused, but the silence that followed carried a deeper meaning than the ruling itself. Claire Whitmore rose slowly from her chair, gathering the simple folder she had brought with her. The movement was graceful and unhurried, as if she had always expected the morning to unfold exactly this way. Andrew Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, staring down at the polished surface of the table. The reflection of the courtroom lights shimmered faintly in the wood. 10 years of marriage had ended not with anger or dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet revelation that left him questioning everything he thought he understood. Around the room, the observers began to stand and collect their belongings, but many of them continued to glance toward Claire with curiosity. Only hours earlier she had been perceived as the quiet wife, leaving a marriage with nothing. Now the story looked very different. Claire turned toward the exit, her posture steady, but as she passed Andrew's table, she paused for the briefest moment. Andrew looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since the judge's final ruling. For a second neither of them spoke. The past 10 years seemed to hover silently between them. "Claire," he said quietly, the confidence that once filled his voice replaced by something far more uncertain. "Why did you never tell me?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had just learned. Claire regarded him calmly, her expression thoughtful rather than bitter. "You never asked," she replied gently. The words were not harsh, yet they held a quiet truth that Andrew could not argue with. Claire gave a small nod, the gesture polite and final, before continuing toward the courthouse doors. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows in the hallway beyond the courtroom, casting long golden reflections across the marble floor. As she stepped outside, the sounds of the city greeted her again. Traffic moved steadily through the Manhattan streets. Pedestrians hurried past with phones in hand and coffee cups balanced between their fingers. Life continued forward exactly as it had before the hearing began. Claire paused for a moment at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out over the city skyline in the distance. The air carried the cool edge of late afternoon. Somewhere behind her, inside the building, the next case was already being called into the courtroom. For a long time people had assumed the quiet woman standing beside Andrew Whitmore lived in the shadow of his success. But the truth had always been something different. She had never needed the spotlight. She had simply chosen to stand outside it. And as Claire Whitmore walked down the courthouse steps and disappeared into the flow of the city, the lesson left behind in that courtroom was simple enough to echo long after the doors had closed. Some names carry power long before anyone realizes what they mean.